always hear every artist complain that posing is hard. It's so hard. It's so hard to draw the figure in many different angles. Yes, but when I see you train or when I see you do exercises, it's never the simple stuff and it's never the spatial awareness that you should be practicing. So if you want to improve your posing, just start with like floating boxes like this that represent the head, the torso, and the pelvis, and then just add sticks to them. Just add simple sticks to the end, like this, to practice your posing. Now, why will this be hard for a lot of you already? Because these sticks that you're drawing, you're not drawing them in 2D, you're actually drawing them in 3D. Because if you don't understand that, like you're gonna have a really hard time always to draw anything about the figure in 3D or in space, because you're never going to understand what their limbs are actually doing. And if you can't understand it for sticks like this, for these simple little sticks, then you're never going to figure it out for more complicated objects like the arm or even cylinders or anything like that. So practicing this will overnight transform how you understand things in space. It's what I talk about over and over. It's your intuition in 3D space on a 2D canvas, which is the hardest thing to actually cultivate. But once you understand it, it becomes much easier, because then you just transform this stick right? To basically like kind of form our mannequin, right? And if we make an exploded view, my figures went from this to this. And no, not because I did more live drawing. If you're like me, you probably have struggled a lot with making characters look dynamic, because even if you understand form, it often feels you're still drawing very rigid mannequins. So, in today's video, I'm going to give you 2 drawing techniques that have massively helped me with my character designs and my character posing. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Antonio. I've been a professional concept artist for the game and film industry for over 8 years, and now I've built ArtWand, the easy-to-follow interactive learning tool for artists. One of the most frustrating parts of figure drawing has always been dynamic figures. The reason for this is simple. The body is doing things it normally shouldn't do, so therefore it's hard for us to see this in our mind's eye, to envision a character actually doing this pose, because we don't really see that in real life. And while reference is often useful, it really didn't help me with my imaginative drawings, because I want to invent new poses. I don't want to copy existing ones. And the reason your mannequins often look stiff is super simple, because this is something you very often neglect when drawing. So we're gonna get into it. Now, the first thing I want to start with is this first technique is to better understand what we can actually do with form. So when we build mannequins, right, we basically build them with these very rigid building blocks. Now, I have to emphasize, we need to start doing this at first. That's how we learn to visualize things, to simplify the human figure. Now, what we often tend to do then is like our first introduction to building a figure is like, hey, we can tilt this box a little bit in space because it better represents the rib cage, and then we can attach like a cylindrical form to that box, and then we can add like another smaller tilted box to that other box, right? To basically like kind of form our mannequin, right? And if we make an exploded view, we'll have like the neck part here, and then the head is going to be over here, right? So this is kind of how we mash our figure together. Now we often leave it at that, and what I often see when people then want to get into dynamic poses, they get all these resources, or you see a lot of these online tutorials that suddenly then talk about something you actually really haven't heard that much about, and you suddenly have to apply, which is like this line of action. You need the line of action, right? And fine, there is something like a line of action, like what is the action doing and how can I add my character do that? But suddenly, you're forced to build an entire character in space correctly, build on a single line. And it gets very confusing and sometimes like disheartening for a lot of people. And what has really helped me is basically apply this concept of line of action to back to what we teach the art watch, which is like form manipulation. But now what we're going to do is we're going to simply really exaggerate that, right? So when we look at, let's say, a cylinder, right, we have this sort of rigid looking form, right? Very easy to understand, especially when we start drawing and we start to understand a cylinder in space, it becomes easier to intuitively draw this. And then, you know, we learn about form manipulation. Basically, our staple technique we use at ArtWatch in our intro to drawing learning path is like, okay, we can taper this form, right? Instead of it being like equal on each side, we can taper these cross sections and basically make something that looks more like a cone. Great. Now we also have something that's called like a center line that runs through this cylinder. And then what we teach, especially if we want to learn spatial awareness, is that, hey, if we have these lines going in space like this, and this kind of moving away, right? We can follow this and create those cylinders in space. Right? So that we basically understand where they overlap, and that we start to understand how things can orient in space following a line, right? And so we're starting to build these resources, or you see a lot of these online tutorials that suddenly then talk about something you actually really haven't heard that much about, and you suddenly have to apply, which is like this line of action. You need the line of action, right? And fine, there is something like a line of action, like what is the action doing and how can I add my character do that? But suddenly, you're forced to build an entire character in space correctly, build on a single line. And it gets very confusing and sometimes like disheartening for a lot of people. And what has really helped me is basically apply this concept of line of action to back to what we teach the art watch, which is like form manipulation. But now what we're going to do is we're going to simply really exaggerate that, right? So when we look at, let's say, a cylinder, right, we have this sort of rigid looking form, right? Very easy to understand, especially when we start drawing and we start to understand a cylinder in space, it becomes easier to intuitively draw this. And then, you know, we learn about form manipulation. Basically, our staple technique we use at ArtWatch in our intro to drawing learning path is like, okay, we can taper this form, right? Instead of it being like equal on each side, we can taper these cross sections and basically make something that looks more like a cone. Great. Now we also have something that's called like a center line that runs through this cylinder. And then what we teach, especially if we want to learn spatial awareness, is that, hey, if we have these lines going in space like this and this and this kind of moving away, right? We can follow this and create those cylinders in space, right? So that we basically understand where they overlap, and that we start to understand how things can orient in space following a line, right? And so we're starting to build in 3D space. Now, Now, if we take that a step further, that broken up line, like what we've drawn right now, can start to become a fluid line, right? And then we do the exact same thing, and we start to draw those cylinders on that line and trying to follow the orientation of this curvy, flowy line in space. So, and it helps us to better like draw and see things in 3D space intuitively. Great. Now, once we can do that, we can basically start to really play with the dynamic nature of the form. And this is where it often gets too complicated for a lot of beginners too fast, is that they focus on the dynamic figure without first starting to draw dynamic form. So instead of having this rigid cylinder, whether it be tapered or just straight like this, what I do is I create a line of action that is super dynamic, like this. And now I try to turn that into a cylinder. So I'm trying to just like really follow this curvature like this, so that I create like a very dynamic looking cylinder, right? And I can do that by just starting with the front face of the cylinder and then making it dynamic. And if I have a bit of form understanding, I can even animate it a little bit to have it have like a bit of a like bend to it, like it's an actual physical form. But in the beginning, you don't necessarily need to do that. You can just as much just draw like this, right? The objective for me here is to help you better push and pull form, because that's ultimately what we're doing. We're trying to push and pull form so that we get more confidence with these forms. So even with the box, let's not just make it a rigid box. Let's try to really push it. So in the beginning, like let's just push it outside of its boundaries. And this is where I really want you to try and start breaking stuff, right? Don't worry about it being technically accurate. Just try to break it as much as you can. And from here, right, if we really pushed it, we can push it further and then start twisting it, right? So it becomes like a box like this that is just like twisted in space. We're really trying to push and pull this shape in as many ways as we can, even to the point where we break it. It doesn't have to make sense. But as soon as that becomes easier for you to do, then again, you can think about your mannequin in the beginning and start drawing very dynamic figures just by putting together different types of dynamic forms. And so then you can start creating figures like this, where in the beginning maybe it's something that doesn't necessarily have to make sense, but at least you're already pushing form, right? You're pushing it that way, you're pushing it this way, you're trying to bend it a little bit, you're trying to be creative with it, right? And then that can evolve into poses that look very dynamic, where you're really trying to keep the proportions accurate. Maybe you're looking at reference and you're really trying to do this based on a reference, and it's a very good exercise to do, because then what you're actually doing is you're looking at a reference and you're trying to really push that reference. But a lot of the times this is an exercise they give you without really first talking about step one, where you try to push and pull form first. Because then, just like you did when you were learning the mannequin, it's about now combining all of that manipulated form. So to get to a pose like this, I don't see it as, oh, I looked at one line of action and that's all I built it around. No, for me it was just like this pose, when I demoed it, it started from just this rib cage that I was really like bending as much as I could, right? That looked at least dynamic to me. And then I bended the cylinder that I understand from the mannequin the other way, right? And I tried to keep physics in mind a little bit, and I'll talk about this more in technique too. But as you can see, right, this is what I'm what I'm trying to think about when I'm drawing these poses. Before I add complexity to my drawings, and by complexity I mean detailing like anatomy, or even the clothing, or just any type of detailing that I want, I'm considering like how far can I push and pull the form of my figures, and I'm still thinking about all of it. I'm not thinking about this anatomically. I'm just thinking about how can I push these forms as dynamically as possible and still have them make sense, right? And this just comes from experience of doing it a lot and failing a lot until the point where it makes sense. But even when often I try to break it, and then sometimes it leads to a very dynamic pose that I wouldn't do if I didn't have that. that first type of sort of that confidence of trying to push and pull form as far as I can. And this is something they do in animation all the time. So that's technique number one. And it's the first one you should probably practice as much as you can. Once you do, you'll see that you'll no longer be concerned with action lines and accuracy, but you'll simply, know how much you can push form and get away with it. And you should trust on your instincts here. Now, technique number two is a bit more conceptual. We are going to talk a bit about action lines, but it's something that has massively helped me and actually something I stole from animation. And I call it the pinch versus stretch principle, but it has many names. And sometimes the rest versus detail principle, which I'm sure you've heard of already, is also applied here. Now, what's so great about this principle is that it helps you simplify an entire pose and actually keep the purpose or the essence of that pose without sacrificing the read of it. What you often see, if we go back to the examples that I have here, right, and I'll zoom in a little bit. So I'm going to start with this very neutral pose. This is just a mannequin, basically. What I'm often trying to do with my poses is actually looking for a place where I can stretch the form or the figure and where I will have that natural pinch because of the stretch. So in this case, I feel this is a good example to start with because we have one side of the body that is stretched, a lot of times with the torso, and then we have the other side which is pinched. And I often really use just these graphics for it. And it's, as you can see, like if we connect that together, right, that feels like a dynamic figure. And so I'm always trying to look for excuses where I can do this. So even here with this small little pose, you can see that's actually in the entire body. I have a stretch that runs all the way into the legs, and then I have sort of the pinch or the area of complexity here. And I'll talk about more examples of that later. Now if we go down, I often will also use this for interaction between characters. So for instance, here we have this stretch here, and we have a stretch here of the character, just like his body is stretching upwards. And then we have the pinch here, or the pinch here, like the complexity of the arm. So sometimes I'm trying to be a bit more creative with it, in the sense of like I will look for a side that is like that has rest. There's not a lot of detail in there, and then one side has more detail, or it has this forcing pinch, so that you have this dynamic between something that is being like extended and something that is being compressed. Because oftentimes they talk about this in animation as well, with like C curves and S curves. You have a C curve and an S curve for a nice flow, and then you have straight lines that often contradict that, or like supplement those lines. But sometimes it gets a little bit too technical, and I'm trying to always simplify the process. But I'm doing the exact same thing here, right? And I'm often using like this curvature line to have like this action forward, which is the stretch, and then we have like a lot of pinch here. So a lot of like detail as well. Like all of the detail exists here in that pinch area, and I'll try to leave that other area in rest. So as you can see here, this horse, its pose is very easy to read from afar, and it's not an accident, right? This is sort of why I steal so much from animation, is because they help you simplify things, but you don't do it at the sacrifice of having a good read, or even at the sacrifice of detail. But oftentimes what we tend to do, especially if you're new to character posing and character design, is that you will sacrifice the read of it for complexity and adding a lot of complexity. But you'll see here as well, is like we have this nice stretch of the pose, and then there's this pinch area, or just this area of detail. So like a lot of this has detail, and the other side doesn't. But that reads really well, because it gives us like this area of rest and an area of detail. But I often also like to think of it as like an area that has just a lot of stretch, and then an area that is pinched or compressed together. And if we look at this incredibly dynamic pose, might be harder for you to recognize where this happens, but it is happening. So we have it in two ways. Basically, we have it on the back, where we have this stretch and this pinch, but we also have it here. So we also have it in the arms. The arms actually have an incredibly nice stretch to them, right? And then we actually, it's more of a line almost that flows into this area of detail, but there's like an area of rest here that also has sort of this curvature, and then here we see a lot of detail. And you see the same in VFX, where this is our sort of stretch and area of rest, because there's nothing here, and then this also has a lot of detail. So we're not overcomplicating the entire frame, and it's also leading into compositionally very nice into where we want the viewer to look. But it's also about the simplicity of the read, which I think is something really, really helpful when you wanna improve your posing. So at first I would start with technique 1, where you just learn how to push and pull form, and then mold that into the proportions of a character, and then just see where you can break it. And don't worry too much yet about, let's say, the balance of things. You know, just break it first and try to be as experimental as you can. Again, apply that aspect of play, and then you can try and see if you can recognize some of these, and you can try and mimic these poses, right? With your mannequin, you can try to mimic these poses and see if I can I really like push my rib cage in the same manner, and sort of also use physics a little bit, because I always like to use physics. If we're stretching one thing, we're gonna pinch one thing. That means if I pinch a cylinder and I'm imagining it as it is made of jello, of like, or literally flesh, right? It's not a wooden cylinder, the mannequin. And that's the problem. Like, oftentimes when you start drawing, you treat the mannequin as if it is made of wood, but then there's too much rigidity, right? And in this case, that's not the case. So it's like I'm trying to mimic this pose with mannequin simple form shapes that apply sort of this push and pull. And you will see this a lot in posing. And even sometimes you can try and take a frame. I think I took one here. Right, and this is from Tarzan as well. And again, I'm not trying to improve this. Tarzan in itself is perfect. But sometimes you can make things more dynamic just for the fun of it. Right, so I did a super rough paint over. But we have this pose, and so what I saw in this pose, by the way, is like we have this stretch and pinch, and then we also have like this pinch here, and more of a somewhat of a stretch here, but not that much. So I was like, what if I really stretch it, right? What if I really like exaggerate that? So that's what I did to this, right? So to give you an idea, I also did it in the hair as well, so to have more a bit of that stretch as well. I don't really have necessarily a pinch area here. I just wanted to add a sense of dynamism to this pose. So it's not like this is a better pose compositionally, like it doesn't necessarily match the story that's going on here. So I'm not trying to correct the original. The original is fantastic, but you see that you can really try and take some poses off of whatever characters that already exist, and you just see if you can make them more dynamic by applying this principle of like really pushing and pulling, or stretching and pinching, or just having areas of detail and areas of rest. Because in this case, even in the paint over, I'm trying to leave this as sort of the area of rest, and then there could be detail here, more detail, like this could be more muscular, right? If I were to draw this from as a character myself, to emphasize the stretchy area, I would have less bumps in them, even though they would make anatomical sense. A lot of the times I will sacrifice that anatomical accuracy to emphasize the simplicity of the read, and then have a lot of my anatomical indication in this area, so that you really get that aspect of a stretchy area and then a area with detail. So there you go. These two drawing techniques have massively helped me with drawing dynamic figure poses from imagination. I think that's important because it will help you just push and pull characters. And I'm very positive that they will help you too. So try to apply them once in a while and see how it goes. You know, maybe even let us know here in the comments. I'd love to hear if it actually helped you. But first, you have to do it. All right? So, as always, happy learning, and I'll see you in the next one.